Ben had always dreamed of leaving the noisy, chaotic city behind for a simpler life. Years of working long hours, dealing with traffic, and living in the heart of a bustling metropolis had worn him down. The idea of moving to a quiet countryside had been simmering in the back of his mind for a long time, and when he finally found an old house for rent on the edge of a small village, it felt like destiny. The listing seemed too good to be true. A charming old, two-story home with plenty of space and a ridiculously affordable price. The photographs in the ad showed a quaint house surrounded by lush greenery and wide-open fields, with the promise of peace and quiet. Ben could hardly believe his luck. The idea of starting fresh, away from the demands of city life, was something he had only ever fantasized about. But here it was, within reach. The drive to the house was picturesque, with winding roads that cut through the countryside, tall trees lining the path, and the occasional glimpse of a small stream running parallel to the road. As he neared the village, Ben felt a sense of calm wash over him, the kind of calm he hadn't felt in years. The village itself was small and quaint, almost like stepping back in time. Cobblestone streets, modest cottages, and a few small shops dotted the area. Life here moved at a different pace, slower and more deliberate. The locals he passed along the way nodded politely as he drove through, but there was an air of privacy about them, as though they were content in their world and had no need for outsiders. That suited Ben just fine. He wasn't looking for companionship, he was looking for solitude. When Ben arrived at the house, he was struck by how peaceful the area was. The house stood alone at the very edge of the village, with no neighbors in sight and surrounded by overgrown grass and towering oak trees that seemed to sway gently in the afternoon breeze. It was an old, weathered house, its stone walls covered in creeping ivy, but it had a certain charm. The front porch, with its old wooden swing, creaked softly as the wind blew. He could imagine sitting there in the evenings, watching the sunset with nothing but the sound of birds in the distance. The inside of the house was just as charming as the outside, if not a little worn down. The wooden floors creaked under his feet, and the furniture left behind by the previous tenants was old-fashioned, but it gave the place a sense of history. Dust floated in the beams of sunlight that streamed through the windows, and the smell of aged wood and earth filled the air. It felt lived in, like a place that had seen many lives pass through its walls. Ben walked through each room, taking in the house's character. There was a fireplace in the living room, its bricks blackened from years of use, and the kitchen, though small, had a cozy feel to it. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms, one of which would serve as Ben's office. The rooms were modest, but had large windows that overlooked the wild, untamed garden in the back. A few broken floorboards here and there and a faint, musty smell were the only signs of the house's age, but none of it bothered Ben. This was exactly what he had been looking for. As he unpacked his belongings over the next few days, Ben found himself falling in love with the house more and more. There was something peaceful about it, a kind of tranquility he had been craving for years. The village, too, was charming in its own way. The locals were polite but distant, always offering a nod or a brief smile when he passed by, but never stopping to chat. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to make friends. He had come to escape, to find solace in the quiet. However, as peaceful as the house was, there was something else about it, something Ben couldn't quite put his finger on. At first, it was just a feeling, a vague sense that he wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't a threatening presence, but more like the house was watching him, quietly observing. It was an old house after all, and Ben brushed off the sensation as nothing more than his imagination adjusting to the new surroundings. The first few days were blissful. Ben spent his mornings drinking coffee on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze as the sun rose over the hills. He'd explore the village in the afternoons, picking up a few essentials from the small grocery store or taking long walks through the countryside. In the evenings, he would sit by the fireplace with a book or simply enjoy the stillness. The quiet was a welcome change from the constant noise of the city, and for the first time in a long while, Ben felt at peace. But soon, things began to change. It started off small, little occurrences that were so subtle Ben barely noticed them at first. One morning, he found the chairs in the kitchen rearranged. He had left them neatly tucked under the table the night before, but when he came downstairs, they were all stacked on top of each other in the middle of the room. It was an odd sight, but Ben didn't think much of it. Maybe he had done it absent-mindedly the night before and just forgotten. He laughed it off, unstacked the chairs, and went about his day. But then, the next day, it happened again. This time, it wasn't just the chairs. The cereal boxes in the pantry had been turned upside down, and the kitchen faucet had been left running, flooding the sink. Ben stood in the doorway, staring at the scene before him, his mind racing for an explanation. He lived alone, and the doors had been locked. There was no one else in the house. It didn't make sense. Still, Ben wasn't one to believe in the supernatural. He convinced himself that it was nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him, maybe some form of sleepwalking. The house was old after all. Perhaps it was just settling, and the chairs had fallen over on their own. The faucet could have been a plumbing issue. He chalked it up to the quirks of an old house and carried on. But as the days passed, the strange occurrences only grew more frequent. Every morning, something was out of place. Sometimes it was harmless. His shoes would be moved to the wrong side of the room, or a door would be opened that he distinctly remembered closing. Other times, it was more unsettling. He'd find the bathroom mirror fogged up with the word BO written across it, as though someone had been standing there just moments before. His reflection would disappear for a few seconds when he looked into the mirror, only to reappear when he blinked. Despite the oddities, Ben didn't feel afraid. In fact, he found it almost amusing. It was as if the house had a personality of its own, a mischievous streak that liked to play pranks on him. He began talking to it as though it were a living thing, addressing the unseen presence in a light-hearted way. "Nice try," he'd say with a chuckle when he found his car keys frozen inside the freezer, or, "Okay, you got me," when the kitchen lights flickered on and off by themselves. To Ben, it seemed like the house, or whatever was haunting it, wasn't malicious. It was playful, like a trickster spirit enjoying the chance to mess with its new tenant. He even started looking forward to the daily pranks, wondering what new trick the ghost would pull next. The villagers, however, seemed less amused. Whenever Ben mentioned the strange occurrences to them, even in a casual, joking manner, their expressions would tighten, and they'd quickly change the subject. It was subtle, but it was clear they knew something he didn't. There was a tension in the air whenever the house was brought up, as though it held some secret the villagers weren't willing to share. One afternoon, while shopping at the small grocery store, Ben overheard two women whispering to each other in hushed tones. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but he caught enough to know they were talking about him and the house. When he approached them, they immediately stopped, offering tight smiles before hurrying off. Ben watched them leave, a knot forming in his stomach. What were they hiding? He pushed the thought aside. He wasn't here to worry about village gossip. The house was his now, and whatever was happening inside its walls, he would handle it. After all, it was just a few harmless pranks, nothing more. At least, that's what he thought. As the weeks passed, the pranks grew more frequent and elaborate, but Ben still couldn't shake the sense of amusement they brought. It was as if he were living with an invisible roommate, one that enjoyed pushing the boundaries of what could be considered a harmless joke. Even as the occurrences grew stranger, Ben continued to downplay the significance, chuckling to himself when his reflection disappeared from the bathroom mirror or when the pantry doors swung open on their own. One evening, as Ben prepared dinner, he noticed that the kitchen radio had turned on by itself. It was an old radio left behind by the previous tenants, and Ben had never bothered to use it. The dial was set to a station that played nothing but static, the noise filling the room as Ben stood there, holding a knife and a half-chopped onion. He turned the radio off, shaking his head with a smile. "All right, very funny," he muttered under his breath. "But could you pick a better station next time?" As if in response, the radio flicked back on, but this time it wasn't static. A strange, old-fashioned laugh echoed from the speakers, a sound that didn't seem to belong to any radio show or program. It was a high-pitched, jiggling laugh, like something out of an old cartoon. Ben froze, his eyes locked on the radio as the laughter continued. It wasn't just a regular laugh, it felt wrong. The pitch was off, the tone too sharp, and it lasted too long, as though whoever was laughing had no intention of stopping. Ben's hands grew clammy as he approached the radio, his breath catching in his throat. He reached out to turn it off again, but as his fingers touched the dial, the laugh abruptly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The kitchen felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in the span of a few seconds. Ben swallowed hard and backed away from the radio, his heart pounding in his chest. "Okay, enough of that," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He glanced around the kitchen, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of the wind outside. He tried to shake off the unease, convincing himself it was nothing more than a glitch in the radio. But deep down, he knew something had changed. The pranks no longer felt playful. There was an edge to them now, a sense of malice that hadn't been there before. It was as if the ghost had grown tired of simple tricks and was now testing the limits of Ben's sanity. That night, as Ben lay in bed, the laughter returned. It wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from somewhere deep within the house. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder. The same high-pitched giggle echoed through the walls, bouncing off the wooden beams and creeping into Ben's ears like a twisted lullaby. He sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside his window. The laughter continued, growing louder with each passing second. Ben threw off the covers and stood, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. He made his way to the hallway, his hand gripping the banister as he descended the stairs. As he reached the bottom step, the laughter stopped. Silence enveloped the house once more, thick and suffocating. Ben stood in the middle of the living room, his heart racing as he scanned the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, no sign of the ghost, no explanation for the eerie laughter that had filled the house moments before. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm himself. "It's just your imagination," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "You're tired, that's all." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. The next morning, Ben woke to find the living room in complete disarray. The furniture had been moved, his armchair was overturned, the coffee table pushed against the far wall, and the bookshelves had been emptied, their contents scattered across the floor. But it wasn't just the mess that unsettled him. No, it was the writing on the walls. In large, bold letters, scrawled in what looked like dark red paint, were the words, "You can't leave." Ben stared at the message, his mind racing. The words loomed over him, filling the room with an oppressive weight. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't just the writing, it was the feeling that came with it. The house felt alive now, more than it ever had before, and whatever was haunting it had made its intentions clear. For the first time since moving in, Ben felt genuine fear. The pranks were no longer funny. They weren't tricks, they were warnings. He rushed to the kitchen, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his phone. He needed to call someone, anyone. But as he grabbed his phone from the counter, he saw that it had no signal. He stared at the screen, willing it to change, but the signal bar remained stubbornly empty. No matter where he went in the house, the phone wouldn't connect. It was as if the house itself was cutting him off from the outside world, trapping him inside. Ben felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead as he paced the kitchen. He had to get out. He didn't care if the writing on the wall was a warning. He wasn't going to stick around and find out what it meant. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and rushed to the front door, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lock. But the door wouldn't open. He pulled harder, twisting the knob with all his strength, but it was stuck, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Ben cursed under his breath, kicking the door in frustration. He tried the back door next, but it was the same. It wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed tight, the locks refusing to give no matter how hard he tapped at them. Panic set in. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. It was keeping him there, trapping him within its walls. The pranks had been fun at first, but now they felt like part of some larger, darker game, one that Ben didn't want to play. He backed away from the door, his mind racing for a solution. He had to find a way out, but every exit was blocked. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned in circles, looking for something, anything, that might offer an escape. And then he remembered the basement. There was a door in the kitchen, one he had never bothered to open before. It led to the basement, a place he had avoided simply because he had no need for it. But now, it seemed like his only option. Ben rushed to the door, yanking it open and flicking on the light. The stairs leading down to the basement were steep and narrow, the wooden steps creaking beneath his weight as he descended. The air grew colder as he made his way down, and a faint, musty smell filled his nostrils. It was dark, even with the dim bulb above, and the walls seemed to close in on him as he reached the bottom. The basement was small, with a low ceiling and a dirt floor. Old, broken furniture was piled up in the corners, covered in dust and cobwebs. But there, in the farthest corner, was something Ben hadn't noticed before, a door. It was small, barely visible in the shadows, and looked like it hadn't been opened in years. His breath hitched as he approached the door, a sense of dread filling him. It was as though the house was guiding him here, leading him to something it wanted him to find. He reached for the handle, his hand trembling as he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that stretched into the darkness. Cold air wafted out from the passage, carrying with it a strange, faint sound, laughter, the same high-pitched, eerie giggle that had haunted Ben for days. Ben stood at the threshold, his heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct told him to turn back, to close the door, and forget he had ever found it. But something deeper, some inexplicable pull, urged him forward. He had to know what was down there. He had to understand why the house was tormenting him. With a deep breath, Ben stepped into the passage. The walls were damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. The laughter echoed all around him, growing louder as he ventured deeper into the darkness. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one sending a chill down his spine. The passage seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. Ben's heart raced as the laughter grew closer, louder, more menacing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the passage opened up into a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room stood a figure, hunched over and motionless, as though waiting for him. Ben stood frozen at the entrance to the small room, his eyes locked on the shadowy figure hunched in the center. The air was thick and cold, filled with the eerie scent of damp earth and decay. His heart raced, pounding in his chest, but he couldn't make himself move. Something about the figure seemed unnatural, distorted, as though it didn't belong in the world of the living. For a long moment, neither he nor the figure moved. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Ben's shallow, uneven breaths. The laughter that had echoed through the passageway was gone now, replaced by a chilling quiet that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He could feel it, the presence of something old and malevolent, something that had been waiting for him to step into this room, into its domain. Ben's hands trembled as he took a slow, cautious step forward, his eyes never leaving the figure. It remained still, hunched over as though asleep or in some deep, unnatural slumber. The dim light from the room's single bulb cast long shadows over its body, obscuring its face. But even in the half-darkness, Ben could see the unnatural proportions of the thing, its long, twisted limbs, its impossibly thin frame, and the way its back arched in a way no human spine ever could. Swallowing hard, Ben forced himself to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" For a moment, there was no response. The figure remained still, as though it hadn't heard him, or perhaps, as though it was deciding whether or not to answer. Then, slowly, agonizingly, it began to move. Its head lifted, and Ben saw the gleam of pale, dead eyes staring back at him from the shadows. The figure's mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, wide and unnerving, stretching too far across its face. And then it spoke. "We've been waiting." The voice was not human. It was low, raspy, and layered, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. The words seemed to crawl across the walls, seeping into Ben's mind like poison. His stomach churned, and he felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to get out of this room, out of this house. but his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so deep it seemed to settle into his very bones. Waiting for what? Ben managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The figure let out a low, mocking laugh, the sound sending icy fingers of dread down Ben's spine. It stood up slowly, unfolding its twisted, elongated body until it towered over him, its shadow stretching across the room. Ben's breath hitched in his throat as the creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "For you," the figure hissed, its grin widening. "You are here because we want you here." Ben's heart pounded in his ears as the realization sank in. The house, the pranks, the strange occurrences, it had all been leading to this. He hadn't just stumbled upon a haunted house. He had been chosen, lured into this place by whatever malevolent force resided here. And now, it wanted him. "No," Ben whispered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. You can't keep me here." The figure's grin faltered, and for a brief moment, its eyes flickered with something like amusement. "Can't we?" With a sudden burst of speed, the figure lunged forward, its long, bony fingers outstretched, reaching for Ben. He barely had time to react. His body moved on instinct, jerking backward as the figure's hand swiped at the air where he had just been standing. Ben stumbled, his back slamming into the wall behind him, and he gasped for breath, his heart racing. The figure laughed again, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. "There is no escape, Ben. You belong to us now." Ben's mind raced. He had to get out. He had to escape this nightmare before it consumed him. But how? The doors were locked, the windows sealed. There was no way out, no way except the basement, the hidden room. Without thinking, Ben pushed past the figure, his feet moving before his brain had time to catch up. He sprinted toward the passageway, his heart hammering in his chest. Behind him, the creature let out an enraged scream, its voice echoing through the narrow walls as it gave chase. Ben didn't dare look back. He couldn't. He knew that if he did, the sight of that twisted, nightmarish thing chasing him would break whatever fragile hold he had left on his sanity. He reached the stairs and bolted upward, his feet pounding against the wooden steps as he raced toward the basement door. The air grew colder, the sound of the creature's footsteps growing louder behind him. It was fast, too fast. Ben could feel it gaining on him, its presence pressing down on him like a weight, suffocating him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. With a final burst of energy, Ben reached the basement door and threw it open. He tumbled out into the kitchen, slamming the door shut behind him and locking it. His chest heaved as he leaned against the door, his entire body trembling. The creature's screams echoed from the other side, but the door held. For now, Ben knew it wouldn't last. The house wouldn't let him leave. He had seen the writing on the walls. "You can't leave." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The house had him now, and it wasn't going to let him go. His mind raced as he looked around the kitchen, searching for something, anything, that could help him escape. His eyes fell on the small key he had found earlier, the one that had unlocked the hidden passageway. Could it help him now? Was there another door? Another exit? There had to be. With trembling hands, Ben grabbed the key and made his way to the front door. The keyhole was small, almost invisible, but there it was. He slid the key into the lock and turned it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the door swung open. Cold, fresh air rushed in, and Ben staggered outside, his body weak and trembling from the ordeal. He didn't stop to look back. He didn't care what happened to the house or the thing that had chased him through its holes. All he knew was that he was free. For now. The laughing ghost. Resolution. Ben drove away from the house, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His mind was still reeling from everything he had experienced. The ghost, the laughter, the twisted figure that had chased him through the house. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But it was over. He had escaped. The key had worked, and he had broken free from whatever hold the house had over him, or so he thought. As he sped down the narrow, winding road leading away from the village, Ben's mind began to clear. The farther he got from the house, the more he convinced himself that it was all in his head, that the ghost, the figure, the writing on the walls, it had all been a product of his imagination, fueled by the isolation and the stress of moving to a new place. But deep down, a part of him knew that wasn't true. He could still feel it, the lingering presence of the house, the cold, malevolent force that had followed him. It wasn't over, not really. As he reached the outskirts of the village, Ben glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was no longer in sight, but the memory of it burned in his mind. The laughter echoed in his ears, faint but unmistakable. And then, just as he was about to turn onto the main road leading back to the city, he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the road, watching him. It was the ghost. Its pale, twisted face grinned at him, its hollow eyes locked on his. Ben's heart skipped a beat, and his foot slammed down on the accelerator. The car shot forward, speeding away from the figure, but the laughter followed him, growing louder and louder until it filled the car, drowning out everything else. He was never going to escape. The house had claimed him, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he drove, it would always be there waiting, watching, and laughing. The end.